Music. So wonderful. Jeff, thank you for bringing Andy and Hannah here today. Jeff Baker made the connection for us. So, we humans have the ability to both empathize deeply with each other and to see each other as mortal enemies. Sometimes we treat people with dignity and respect, and other times we dehumanize and kill each other. So today I want to explore this bizarre juxtaposition so that we can answer questions like, should I feel enemies for people who oppose me politically? Should I make an enemy out of them? Should I see people who are displaying bigotry, sexism, racism, homophobia? Should I see them as enemies? Or should I empathize with them? Sometimes people think that it's okay and sometimes just excusable to treat people like enemies. Sometimes we just write them off and marginalize them and say, I'm not going to try to connect with them. And sometimes we do that with nuclear-armed dictators and neo-Nazis. So I'm going to be exploring the extremes of this behavior to a degree, empathizing deeply on the one hand and creating enemies that should be exterminated on the other, but I want to emphasize that we all do this all the time in slightly lesser degrees every day. We can demonstrate these capacities. We feel regularly empathy for people, whether it's a child who scrapes their knee in Rittenhouse Square or for a homeless person out in their luck. But we can also treat people like shallow caricatures. We can swear at the driver that cut us off on the Schuylkill Expressway. We can hang up rudely on the caller trying to consolidate our credit card debts. And less directly, but perhaps more importantly, we all contribute to dehumanizations by pouring tax dollars into systems that treat people like objects. For example, our criminal justice and prison system. We all do that, collectively and individually. But I hope that you can focus on how in your life, in less extreme ways, on a mundane level, we tend to make enemies and create friends, and how that tension is for us in our lives. I'm going to start by discussing how we create enemies in our minds so that it's easier to kill them. That seems a bit crude, but the amount of times we ask people to take the lives of others makes it important to talk about this, especially war. And it matters whether you're the person doing the killing or you're the person ordering somebody to kill someone else. So if you are a commander of a troops about to go into war, how do you motivate a soldier to kill somebody? Someone they don't even know, somebody that maybe has done nothing to them individually. Well, first you make killing easy, and technology does that. Weapons are useful for that because as a killing machine, the human body is pretty anemic. We don't have claws, teeth, or venom. And so when we're contemplating just using our bodies, strangulation is very difficult and messy. I mean, it does require time and strength and the persistence to put up with a panicked victim with bulging eyes and grunts for help. We are not killing machines by nature. So obviously, weapons that kill at a distance dehumanize people. Snipers can kill somebody a mile away. Nuclear weapons can kill people with just a touch of a button. And obviously, this dehumanization deprives victims of our most potent human ability to stop interspecies violence. And that ability is our ability to plead for compassion, to display our shared humanity. In other words, to evoke empathy in the other person. A second way to get people to kill besides weapons is tribalism. Right? Tribalism. War propaganda does this very well. And during the last century, U.S. propaganda was, Uncle Sam wants you to join the U.S. Army. He wants you to be on their team. And it was very useful in creating recruitment efforts. Elites on all sides of the world's wars did this. They wanted to get the combatants to see each other as members of a tribe and see other people as homogeneous, not as individuals, but as a mass of similar entity. John Gower, who was a professor at the University of California, described one World War II example. He said, "It was not that the Japanese people were in actuality homogeneous and harmonious, devoid of individuality, and thoroughly subordinated to the group, but rather that the Japanese ruling groups were constantly exhorting them to become so. What the vast majority of Westerners believed Japanese to be coincided with what the Japanese ruling elites hoped they would become." End quote. So this process of de-individuation reinforces tribalism and is used by governments around the world. A third element, weapons, tribalism, you also make the other seem dangerous. So posters during world wars depicted enemies as monsters and devils with claws and angry eyes coming at you out of the hellfire of war. Leading up to World War II, Nazi regime used exaggerated caricatures of malicious-looking Jewish people who are behind a curtain operating levers to manipulate the economy for their own good against good Aryan Germans. Add to that sensationalized sexual violence, which is quite often used in war propaganda. The German Hun, as the caricature was made out to be, was often a large-looking brute with a pointed helmet with a naked woman thrown over his back. This worked after the Civil War when racists embraced the myth of over-sexualized ex-slaves. Like in Birth of a Nation, if you've watched that film, where a white actor in blackface is stalking a white girl. So sexualized violence is also used to dehumanize. We also make enemies out to be animals, beasts, or insects that need to be exterminated. A common example would be pestilence spreading rodents. One common example was Jewish faces were also often placed onto the bodies of rats. Japanese were also portrayed as rats with buck teeth and pointy ears. And one German poster had an example of a spider with a Star of David on its back, weaving the web to entrap Germans. So this dehumanization is used by governments, and it's often supported by what is called military necessity. In terms of how can a soldier act quickly if they're thinking of their victim as a human being? If you're acting to neutralize a target, words we use to dehumanize people, some say you put the soldier's life in danger if you ask them to think of their target as a victim. I get that. War is complicated, and you can't complicate it any further, some will say. There's a film called Faces of the Enemy. Sam Keane was the producer of it. And it does a great job in showing how dehumanization works, because we crave simplistic thinking. Though life is complicated, we want to think things simply. It's easy, at least for me it is, to see things in ethical black and white, right? Very clear contrasts. We often either get involved in hero worship or demonization of the other. We want a clear distinction between the good and the bad. And when you're thrust into the madness of war, sometimes it's just easier to see the enemy as completely evil and without any potential of redemption. It makes complicated and involved moral thinking unnecessary. A professor at Emmanuel College, Michelle Mace, said that dehumanization leads to what she called moral exclusion. And that's the process of seeing somebody as being so evil that you don't even have to take them into account in your moral calculus. They are outside of the ethical sphere. She says that moral exclusion allows us to use the other as a vehicle for psychological projection. Many of you know what that means. Taking the ugly characteristics of ourselves and projecting them onto another person. When we're unable to process our own unconscious bad habits or even occasional savagery, we express it by seeing the other person as a savage. And when this happens, the enemy can become a psychologically embedded feature of our psyche. The ugly enemy stereotype becomes permanent as a part of our conscious and unconscious life. Now, I've spoken here a number of times about how we do this with animals all the time. We take animals, especially ones like snakes and spiders and rodents and sharks, and make them into super killing machines, evil, aggressive, looking at us. it justifies sort of the trophy-hunting hunter shooting and killing animals because the animals are evil and we're good. Gorillas were made to look out that way in Victorian novels quite often. The ape-like soldiers portrayed in war propaganda is more effective because we've already demonized other species. War for the Planet of the Apes is a blockbuster, in part because it appeals to stereotypes that we already have, that apes are brutes and warlike. We link gorillas and war quite often, even though war is more of a human practice. A clear appreciation for gorillas, I know, came to me when watching films of Jane Goodall, reading Diane Fossey and other people's work that showed that, in fact, although there are exceptions, gorillas are usually gentle, compassionate, and vegetarian creatures. Personally, I find myself very moved in looking at the face of gorillas, the deep, empathetic eyes, and it makes me feel like they are capable of empathy, deep empathy, for each other, and even for their human people who are capturing them and putting them in zoos. Let me move on to what is empathy then. The ability to understand what another person is going through and feel the feelings that they are feeling is quite often how we describe it. Last month there was an interesting article in the Washington Post that talked about 3 types of empathy. Jennifer Brady Wallace wrote it. She says the first type of empathy is cognitive empathy. And this is the ability to understand intellectually what's going on in somebody else's experience. This type of empathy usually involves some form of acknowledging and imagining the state of mind of another creature. And although it's the simplest type of empathy, it does require that we have an ability to read verbal and physical cues, like tone of voice and facial expression. And some people say that cognitive empathy is the most important of all because it's in all forms of empathy. Empathy is not just feeling, it requires a cognitive understanding that another creature is having an experience and what that experience might be like. And interestingly, you can in fact practice cognitive empathy when you're alone. Just pick up a novel and try to imagine what the characters are feeling. So you can practice cognitive empathy. You can get better at it by studying it, by opening your eyes and seeing what's going on. But the second type of empathy Wallace talks about is called emotional empathy, and that's when we actually feel the same emotions another person is feeling. And we can argue how dramatically or accurately we can do that, but it's an important part of human social culture. I mean, young children who have not yet formed clear, separate identities, if a toddler starts to cry, quite often all the toddlers in the room will start to cry without even knowing why. There's such emotional empathy. But adults can also find themselves getting caught up in extreme emotional empathy, unable to separate themselves from people that they're trying to feel empathy for. That's what creates codependent relationships that are unhealthy, when people over-identify with each other. It can lead to relational problems. Lois Kellerman, who's an ethical culture leader living in California, wrote a wonderful book called Marriage from the Heart. I give it to couples sometime when I do weddings. And it's about how life partners need some distance between each other. She uses the analogy of saying that 2 people make harmony when their tones are slightly different. A musical analogy. To be different allows for people to have healthy, autonomous relationships where both people can be independent and strong and able to support each other. If you only and always feel the emotions of other people, it may drain you of the emotional resources to be yourself, to be the person the other person fell in love with in the first place. Richard Davidson, who's at the University of Wisconsin, is a neuroscientist, and he said that when people actually experience empathizing people deeply, especially when somebody is suffering or anxious or depressed, quote, your brain will show activation of the very same circuits as the brain of the person with whom you are empathizing. So if this is chronic, it can be unhealthy and unproductive for everybody involved. When an extremely empathetic person is open to all the suffering of the world, it can be overwhelming, right? Which is why Felix Adler talked about this as one of the greatest spiritual pains. to be so open to the suffering in the world, this bottomless pit. Maybe a good person is open to that, but a good person who is effective at stopping the suffering often needs some distance to stay healthy themselves. A third type of empathy, which I think includes this, Wallace discusses, is called compassionate empathy. And this empathy is the type where you, quote, feel concern about another's suffering, but from a more of a distance, with a desire to help the person in need. So in this case, you're aware of the other's suffering, you have cognitive empathy, but you also have a certain degree of emotional empathy as well. You are actually feeling some of them, but add to that sufficient emotional distance and a commitment to act to lessen the suffering. That's what makes compassionate empathy. And it's more than just picking a middle ground between feeling too much empathy and dehumanization. It is connected to the desire to act and the willpower to carry through. That's fundamental. It's healthier for the person feeling empathetic, and it's important to those who are suffering. I mean, I think most people who are victims care less about whether other people worry about their being a victim than stopping being a victim. That's what matters. And so it brings me to the crux of my talk today. Should we feel empathy for people whom we label enemies? Whether they're enemies that oppose us politically, or who have slighted us, or who display bigotry, racism, sexism, homophobia. Should we feel empathy for North Korean dictators and neo-Nazis and presidents? Most of you who know me know that I'm going to answer yes. I do so because when I ask myself questions like that, I think about people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and the advice they gave me. And King said in 1956, we must use the weapon of love. We must have the compassion and understanding for those who hate us. We must realize that so many people are taught to hate us and that they are not totally responsible for that hate. Feeling compassion for people that hate you is difficult. It's nearly impossible. But it's not impossible. King doesn't use the term empathy, but he does challenge me to feel empathy. Cognitive empathy, just understanding what's going on, can be a tool with people you vehemently disagree with, or you label as an enemy, or who hate you, for that matter. And whether you want to confront the person violently or verbally, or you want to make them your friend, it's still worthwhile to know what's going on in their head. So cognitive empathy is fundamental. It's part of human wisdom. I mean, I used it in 25 years of teaching history when I asked my students, think of what it was like to walk off a ship from Eastern Europe with no money into the streets of New York City. The sociology professor, Sam Richards, said that sociology is the study of the way in which human beings are shaped by things they don't see. And he said in order to do that, quote, start with empathy. It all begins with empathy. Talk yourself out of your own shoes and put yourself into the shoes of another person. There's a play at the Painted Bride, November 10th and 11th, that Taya Sepnik is doing. She's rehearsing here, in fact. Bob, there's some flyers there. Just raise one up. There are flyers out on the table. The name of the program is Walk in My Shoes, and she's co-producing this with Altavisi, who is the inspector from the Philly Police Department who told her story here to us a couple of weeks ago. So I urge you to go on the 10th and the 11th. See anybody on the Ending Racism Committee who'd like to go. Sylvia and Eric, I know, are going to go on the 10th and the 11th. So see them and pick up a flyer on the way out. They're on the table out there too. Because walking in the shoes of another person is the idea that I'm getting across today. And it was the idea behind the world's first empathy museum. This was a project by Roman Krizarnik, who founded it in 2015. And he said he did so because he wanted to challenge people to see through the eyes of another, to transform their personal relationships in the process of helping tackle global challenges such as prejudice, conflict, and inequality. He emphasizes that the times when it is most important to feel empathy for somebody else is usually when it's most difficult to feel empathy for somebody else. And if you don't practice it, you won't be ready. When we're challenged, when our adrenaline is flowing, when we have righteous indignation because we know we're right, our understanding narrows, and our reptilian brainstem takes control of our actions and our thoughts. But when we're challenged is when we need to understand the challenger the most. And to understand somebody who's challenging you doesn't mean that you're going to be soft. It's not about surrender. Krishna actually says we have to stop thinking about empathy as a sign of sentimentality and capitulation. He counsels that we practice empathetic dissent. He says you try to understand people's emotional frameworks, which allows them to do and say things you find morally repulsive. He insists that the process of moral judgment is not compromised by empathy. Buddhist teacher Robert Thurman suggested that we can oppose others with what he calls fierce compassion. I like those two phrases, empathetic dissent and fierce compassion. You don't have to indulge another person, Thurman writes, in their evil-doing and their nasty behavior, and sometimes you have to be forceful. But he says that this force need not be, quote, have that extra bite, that extra sting of hatred, of vindictiveness in us. It's just forceful opposition to whatever negative things they're doing. Krishna talks about Atticus Finch, who gives advice to his daughter Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. He says, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And at the Empathy Museum, you read and you view and you try to imagine what it's like to walk in somebody else's skin. He counsels visitors that go to the museum to see empathy as the ultimate form of travel, a means of transporting ourselves into the lives of others in ways that can illuminate our own. There's no need to limit where we take the journey, he says. We must extend our empathetic imaginations not just to the deprived, the disadvantaged, but also to those whose views and actions we might oppose or disdain. From wealthy bankers to bombastic politicians to racist work colleagues, and even to the sibling who breaks our toys. There are few better ways of bringing us face to face with our own prejudices and our own uncertainties and inconsistencies than empathy. Empathy can become a moral guide and a philosophy of living. I mean, Socrates said, know thyself is the key to living. The lesson of empathy, Krishna said, is that we will only discover ourselves by stepping outside of ourselves. And I think when we understand empathy as a tool to self-improvement, that's when it's most valuable. That was certainly how Felix Adler, who founded Ethical Humanism, believed it was. He said that we as individuals are not complete until we better understand our relationships with the world. As we gain more wisdom about other people, those we love, those we hate, and even those we have mundane relationships with, like cab drivers or store clerks, when we understand them and our reaction and our relationship with them, we can then better know ourselves. I mean, I know myself better by understanding myself as a father, as a husband, as an ethical culture leader, as a taxpayer, as a fellow citizen. All of those roles, those connections to other people, and the effects and the emotions wrapped up in those relationships are a part of who I am. My economy is not threatened by these relationships, it's made by these relationships. Who I am as a unique person is a part of my connection to others. Even my relationships with my enemies. It's not easy. It takes practice. It takes discipline. It takes the support of a community to do it. When people disapprove of us, when they disagree with us about important things, it's not easy. Dostoevsky said, while there's nothing easier than to denounce the evildoer, nothing is more difficult than to understand him. This is true of our own negative qualities too, I think. Nothing is easier than to blame ourselves and say, I'm too lazy, or I'm too this, or I'm too that, than to understand why we say that about ourselves. Our shadow is elusive. Thich Nhat Hanh helped me appreciate how life's negatives can be made into positives. He used to say that when you put garbage in the ground, it can help grow flowers. But you have to pay attention to the negatives. So when we look at creating empathy in ourselves, we also have to look at the sparks of anger in us, our maliciousness, our impatience with other people, and learn from that how to grow. It's almost as if we look at our enemies as a gift, testing us and showing us how to bring out our best selves. Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist, said that underneath the mask of the enemy, we ultimately recognize ourselves. So in this quest for knowledge about ourselves and the world, it's not enough just to have cognitive empathy, to understand intellectually what's going through it in other people. It may be necessary to feel how they are feeling. And I will admit, I find it challenging to imagine feeling very much of what is going on inside of somebody who's doing cruel and malicious things. It makes me worry that I'm going to fall into that pit and become them. But compassionate empathy, when there is enough distance and it's linked to connecting, to trying to help those people become better, that's the challenge that I want to lay before you today. Because I think it can help us defend our own views better. When we are more aware of our own impatience, when we are more conscious about being empathetic and then acting to end the suffering in the other that's creating their bad behavior, I think we're more effective at defending our values. We're more effective, but we have to give up easy, comfortable, simplistic thinking. Because it's complicated to know that we have within us some of the angel and some of the beast. So unless it's to prevent immediate harm, I do think it's okay to feel empathy for a nuclear-armed dictator or a Nazi or a president. And I try to treat people as being of inherent worth. I try fierce compassion. I try empathetic dissent. Because I believe it's a path to self-wisdom, to understanding others, their motives, their suffering, and it helps me turn enemies towards being a friend. Thank you.